welcome to Limelight Arts Travels podcast, A Closer Look. We celebrate Leonardo da Vinci as a painter today, but he saw himself as a creative working across many genres, of which painting was perhaps the least personally significant. In the late 15th century, Leonardo spent an important period at the Sforza court in Milan, working on a staggering range of projects for Duke Ludovico il Moro. While busily designing court spectacles and celebratory architecture, canals and military infrastructure, embroidery designs and monumental works of public sculpture, Leonardo also found time to undertake some of the most important paintings of his career. In this episode, Dr. Nick Gordon joins me to discuss one of Leonardo's most accomplished portraits, The Lady with an Ermine. Hello, Nick. Thanks so much for coming in today to talk to us about this painting by Leonardo da Vinci.
Thanks, Kathleen.
Could you start by describing it for us, for those people who might be listening along today?
Yes. What we're looking at here is a portrait of a woman who is holding an ermine. The ermine, too, is looking not directly out at us, but like the woman is looking diagonally out of the frame of the portrait, but neither are making eye contact. Her body, which is beautifully dressed, with the detachable sleeves in red, with the brocade work on those, with a blue mantle, with the necklace, her earrings, her hair kind of very fashionably done. Her body is facing towards the left of the portrait frame, whereas her head, along with the ermine's head, are both turned towards the right. The background that we see today is a deep, dark colour with an inscription written across the top of the painting, although we think that both the inscription and the background were later additions, as that sort of deep, dark background was much less common in Leonardo's time, but were much more frequent in a later period. And we think that that background, which really highlights the play of light across the lady's face, across the ermine, across her hand, is really amplified by that darkness, whereas it would have been a much more subtle background that we would have seen much more familiar to us from Leonardo's other paintings, where you get that kind of a play of light and a softness of where the line between where one thing starts and another thing ends is. So I suppose unlike what we expect of most Leonardo's, this one has quite a sharp line dividing the woman from the background, the subject matter from its context.
Yeah, I mean, this very small work of oil on walnut wood, one single panel of walnut wood, which is gives an indication, I think, of how small it is at about 54 by 40 centimetres. It's a reason today to go to Krakow, isn't it? Because it's been there since the end of the 18th century. But we know that this work, thanks to contemporary descriptions of it, was produced at the end of the 15th century, and Leonardo found himself in Milan at this time. That's right?
Yes, absolutely. He was working in the court of Ludovico Sforza.
When Leonardo was working there, we know from a kind of a resume that he compiled and maybe sent, we don't know if he sent it, but we have his resume intended for the Duke of Milan before he moved to Milan at the end of the 15th century to work there. And he describes himself as being able to do lots of different kinds of things, and painting is almost the least important thing to him in that list. And yet he completes some of his most important painting works while in Milan, and complete's an operative word, isn't it? Because as you've described, more or less this portrait, not the background, but more or less the portrait here is completed by Leonardo himself. And we have sketches, preparatory sketches that he made in order to execute it as well. So do we know who we're looking at here? If we know where Leonardo was and we know who he was working for, who is the lady with the ermine?
It's usually taken to be Cecilia Gallerani, who was one of the Duke of Milan's mistresses. Yes, and how she was, was described as being one of the great beauties of the time. For example, have kind of ambassadors in their letters back, their diplomatic letters, but along with also their private letters back, describing her as being one of the great beauties of the period, a flower, as well. So kind of, yes, and she seems here to have been um, probably painted. Uh, at the time when she was kind of one of the more significant mistresses of the Duke, possibly even while she was pregnant.
Yeah, I mean, Ludovico il Moro had a number of mistresses, and Leonardo paints a beautiful a portrait of another of them as well. So the so-called Belle Ferronnière that survives. So she's not unusual in being a mistress of Ludovico il Moro, but she was one of his more obsessive relationships, and one of the only kind of lovers he has to drive a bit of a wedge at one point between himself and his wife, Beatrice d'Este, the sister of the perhaps better known Isabella d'Este. At one point, he gives them the same dress to wear, which seems like an extraordinary oversight of diplomacy, to give your wife and your mistress the same thing to wear. But at a later point in time, obviously, the relationship, the rift is healed, because Isabella d'Este actually asks Cecilia Gallerani to lend her this portrait at a later point in time so that Isabella can have a look at the portraits of Leonardo and work out if she wants to go forward with commissioning one from him herself. So it's interesting to think that this work was retained by Cecilia, kind of a gift from her lover's primary court artist, Leonardo. So this is a late 15th century portrait of a woman. It's a genre that Leonardo is credited with really revolutionizing when we think about something like the Mona Lisa. When you look at this portrait, is there a particular element that leaps out at you as being quite noteworthy?
Well, I think kind of the prominence of the ermine in the foreground is quite noteworthy. So it's not uncommon for there to be some object of symbolic importance, whether it's a religious painting or not. So you think of all of those paintings of Christ holding a bird or something like that. But here, the ermine, which is beautifully rendered, and we know that Leonardo spent a lot of time observing animals, not only just observing them anatomically when they're dead, but actually observing them while they're living. And that's something that I think is very striking about the ermine here, is that we have, it's almost as if the portrait of the ermine is better than the portrait of the woman. The ermine has the range of expression in its face. You can see as well that the ermine is poised with its left arm coming up and out. Its head, you can tell it's kind of, its gaze looks like it's quite firmly directed, almost like with its left hand, it's getting ready to swat at something that you can't see out beyond the frame. But the ermine too is not an accidental choice. We know that on the one hand, the ermine was used as a symbol of purity in this period. And kind of, I think we hardly get a sense as well of just the tactility of it, that kind of, this is an animal that kind of, it's a purity that you would want to attain or would want to maintain, the way that she's kind of dragging or drawing the animal in towards her. So I think there's an expressiveness in that, again, drawn on the ermine. That's something that it may wish to escape. It may wish to be swatting at something off the screen, but she is containing it within herself. And also, I suppose that the ermine has other resonances too. So it ties in with the etymology of her family name, and that's partly how we know how to further identify this picture. As well as being the ermine was a chivalric order, one of the orders created by the kings of Naples. So again, we have this, and Ludovico, her partner, was a member of that order as well. So we have this range of different meanings and associations kind of centered on the ermine, which in many respects is being in the foreground of the painting, in the foreground of a portrait, is one of the things that's drawing us in towards it. But Kathleen, I know this is a period too that you know exceptionally well. Are there other things that draw your attention to it?
Yeah, absolutely. First, I'd just say that I agree with you that in a sense, this is a portrait of a ermine with a woman attached to it rather than a portrait of a lady with an ermine. There's much more individualization of the ermine in some ways than there is of Cecilia Gallerani, which I guess is not surprising for Leonardo when we think about his love of natural history, that he would be so intrigued by the animal. And I think his use of the oil medium here, I mean, it excels in so many ways here, but it's particularly beautiful if you zoom in on the ermine. You know, each individual piece of fur on that ermine is highlighted in a different kind of tactile way to the piece next to it, and it has that, as you said, that kind of sense of movement that's being contained, what was described by contemporary viewers. Contemporary viewers praised this portrait for its sense of imminence, that you feel that both the woman and the creature are turning as one because something is happening. And contemporary viewers said, obviously, what we should understand here is that their master, the master of the woman and the master of the ermine, is entering the room at the same time. And that has to be Ludovico, obviously. So it was praised for that beautiful sense of imminence. For me, when I look at it, I think about Leonardo as strangely, as a fashionista. So Leonardo was described by contemporaries as taking, very kind of contrary to the contemporary descriptions of his great rival Michelangelo, he was described as taking a high amount of care in his personal appearance. His hair and his beard were praised for always being clean. The exact opposite of the comments that are made about Michelangelo's personal hygiene. And we're also told by his friends that Leonardo dressed wherever possible in pink and purple. And when we look at Raphael's great fresco of the School of Athens in the Vatican museums today, the figure who is generally credited as being a portrait of Leonardo da Vinci is in fact wearing pink and purple, which I've always loved. So Leonardo was a personal fashionista. He leaves certain items of clothing to his lover and workshop assistant, Salai. So he understood the value of fashion and of self-representation. And this was something that he had in common with his patrons at the Sforza court. Beatrice d'Este, the legitimate wife of Ludovico il Moro, is praised as a fashion plate. Her sister, Isabella d'Este, writes to her husband, Ludovico the Moor, asking him to tell her in his letters what her sister is wearing when she goes out to church so she can copy her sister's fashion trends. She instituted a particular hairstyle, which Cecilia is shown wearing here, which I think is fabulous. And Leonardo, I beg your pardon, he was hired as a court artist to fit into that tradition. One of the things he did when he was in Milan was to design embroidery patterns for the women at court. And we have one of those if we pull in on Cecilia's right shoulder. Her gown is actually embroidered with the so-called Vincian knot, which is one of the designs we have from Leonardo's sketchbooks when he was working in Milan. But every element of what she is wearing is absolutely the height of fashion. Her head is covered in a gossamer veil, which you only realize when you think, well, what is that gold line across her forehead? That's the gold braid on the edge of a gossamer thin silk veil held in place on her head by that black ribbon. Ribbons were extremely expensive silk and velvet ribbons. That's why sleeves were detachable, because you put all of that investment of silk and velvet into the sleeves of a Renaissance woman's garment. Those jet beads, which if you pull in again, are casting a delicate shadow on the décolletage of Cecilia here. She is such a fashion plate. And so when I look at this, I see her extraordinary beauty, beautiful as a flower, as you said, but also she's the height of fashion, something that the women at the court of the Sforza in Milan were renowned for in Italy at this time. But I also look at her face and her hand, which I think are important achievements of this portrait here. Do they have a similar kind of impact on you?
They do. It's the way that I think out of that gesture, that kind of, in many respects. So you can see in her face, there's an expression, perhaps of not as something as strong as bemusement or surprise, but there's some sudden alertness, which you can see in her lips, but in like often happens with Leonardo's other portraits, the eyes are not really saying very much. They're being treated as objects of study. Sort of, this is how you paint an eye. Yes, the pupils are in the right way, but these eyes don't convey anything the way that other portraitists use eyes in this period. Her hand, however, is shown in a posture that's very difficult to paint. It's very difficult to draw. All those different, not just the movements of different through the joints, but the way that he's showing the pressure that she's applying to the ermine's shoulders with her hands, that there's just enough pressure to keep the animal in place. And you can see that with the tensing of the different tendons in the back of her hand, but there's no sense of force being applied. So this is a firm but gentle touch that she's applying here, as you would if you were, say, holding a pet. You don't want it to run off and escape across the room, but nor do you want to bruise its very delicate flesh beneath you. And I think it's a wonderful study of a hand because it's showing a hand in action, but it's showing a hand in action that is a gentle action rather than kind of I don't know, what we might find in other, say, history paintings, for example, where it's the hand you can really see is grasping the sword as it's being used to, I don't know, cut Goliath's neck, for example.
So it's kind of it's an appropriate kind of level of energy for a woman to be applying in that sense. There's such strength in the hand, as you point out. We have Leonardo's preparatory drawings of this hand in one of his sketchbooks. So it's got this kind of anatomical, scientific accuracy, which we know Leonardo is always interested in throughout his entire artistic and creative production. But it's also appropriate to her. It's such a lily white hand. You know, she's an upper middle class woman who doesn't go out into the sun, and she's as white as the pure fur of the ermine that she holds. So it's also a kind of a symbolic appropriateness about her status as a woman as well. I think this is something we talk about, how Leonardo revolutionizes portraits of women in the 15th century, and we usually look at, say, the Mona Lisa or the portrait of Ginevra de' Benci, to portraits from his Florentine periods. Those are the ones we usually say are revolutionary, because the sitter looks at us and makes eye contact with us, and we feel like we get to know her a little more. And as you say here with Cecilia, we don't really get to know her, and maybe that's appropriate for a woman of her class. She's an upper middle class lover of a duke. She's not a duchess herself. We're not her subjects. In a sense, we're her peers, or most people who would have looked at this portrait would have been her superiors in a social sense. So he's not revolutionizing those things, but I think in that kind of scientific attention to the ermine and to the hand, he's bringing to bear other kinds of innovations on this portrait.
Exactly, I agree. And I think as well, that points to, I think, something about Leonardo's observations, that, yes, he is observing a hand scientifically. We do know that he is analysing how hands actually work in order to be able to paint them better. He's analysing them anatomically. But there's something in this hand that's also showing that he's a great observer of people, that this is the sort of action that a person would make with a pet that they care for, that it still has that kind of that close observation of actual human behaviour, even as it's shown through a hand. And as you point to, he's able to make that hand symbolic of the sitter, or what the Duke wants conveyed about the sitter.
I think if you think of the three great Italian artists of this period, Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael, you've got Leonardo, who's such a scientific observer, and that also carries over, as you've said, to his interest in people, and he was described as being a great person to spend time with, excellent sense of humour. Part of his job at the Sforza court was to tell entertaining stories and play kind of card games with cards that he designed that he could then use to tell entertaining or grotesque stories with. And he was seen as being a very warm person. So I think that scientific interest that he had in the world around him carried over to a kind of a personal connection as well. And then on the other hand, you've got Michelangelo, who's described in his own time as being so obsessed with getting to the core of something, the kind of essence in a Platonic sense of what's inside something, a philosophical essence, rather than, warm, fuzzy human relations or warm, fuzzy interactions between people and animals, for example. And then you've got Raphael, who fuses both of them. So when he's coming up as an artist, he gets to look at both Leonardo and Michelangelo and synthesize with his perfect technique and perfect kind of diplomacy as a courtier, synthesize those two great influences that are the inheritance that he has from the previous generation in his time. And so when I look at this portrait, I immediately think of a portrait by Raphael of a similar size of a woman holding a unicorn in the Galleria Borghese in Rome. So although when we talk about Leonardo, we talk about how he revolutionizes female portraiture in the Mona Lisa and in the portrait of Ginevra de' Benci, I think, the fact that Raphael goes to this portrait in order to come up with kind of, in his case, an adapted portrait. He doesn't start out making a portrait, but he ends up making a portrait of a woman holding a unicorn. Clearly, there's something about this composition that has an echo in the next generation of Italian art as well.
Which is amazing in itself. And I think that's sort of a natural place for us to end this discussion, and perhaps we'll continue it with portraits by some Italian painters in the following generation.
That would be very enjoyable. Thanks, Nick.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Limelight Arts Travels podcast, A Closer Look. It was recorded on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and we acknowledge and pay our respects to the traditional custodians of this land and their elders past and present.